long time since I've been in front of y'all, and I miss doing that, frankly. And so I don't know how well this will go. I think it'll go well, but we'll see. So I wanted to start off this morning talking just briefly about the baptism of Christ, and then we're going to move on into the Isaiah passage. It's really my idea here this morning. And I'll just let you know it's a little warm up here where I'm standing. The physics are really bad in a church place because the people who really need it warm are out there where it's cold, and the people who would like it colder up here where it's hot. So there's about a 20 degrees difference between the floor and up there where the men sit and stand during the worship service. If you see us perspiring up there sometime, you'll know what's going on. So anyway, so this is in the liturgy. If you go back and look at the lectionary, this is the baptism of Jesus Sunday. Sunday we talk about that. A lot of times we've been in services where we'll have a remembrance of your baptism ceremony. You come up and, touch the water and remember your baptism. I find it interesting. I grew up in the Baptist church, and so I actually remember my baptism because I was about 9 when I got baptized. A lot of lifelong Methodists were baptized when they were infants and probably don't remember anything about it. So I'm not here to debate how we ought to be baptizing or whatever, but the baptism of Jesus marks the beginning of his public ministry. That's really what that's all about. The Jews had ceremonial washings that they would do, and I hate to tell the Methodists this, but they did it by immersion. I know that, not that I think God cares, frankly. That's how they did it, though. So there was this practice of ceremonial washing. As a matter of fact, a lot of the pools you read about in the New Testament, that's what they were there for. The pools around the temple would be for ceremonial washings. And as a matter of fact, when a Gentile became a Jew, became a proselyte, if you will, they would have a baptism ceremony as a part of that. They would also say that they were born again. That is why when Jesus goes to see Nicodemus in John chapter 3, and he says, "You must be born again," it wasn't that Nicodemus didn't know about those words. It was that he never had bothered to apply them to himself. That was the issue in John chapter 3. He thought he had been born into salvation. We talked about that a little bit this morning in Sunday school. So let's just remember Jesus' baptism as the beginning of his ministry. And then I want to move on to the Isaiah passage. If you want to read great descriptions of who Jesus was, there is no better place to do that than the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is full of great passages about who Jesus is and how he lived his life when he was here on earth. And this is one of them. You can always spot them. They always start with this, "My servant will do whatever." This one happens to be one of my favorite ones. And what I want to really concentrate on this morning is the first 2/3 of verse 3, which says, "A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out." Now, that is out of the NIV. In other versions, they talk about a dimly lit wick. Say that fast 3 times. A dimly lit wick he will not extinguish or not put out. To me, the smoldering wick he will not snuff out just rolls better off the tongue. And so that's the one I wanted to use this morning. The other ones actually are probably a more accurate translation of the Greek. But we'll see, you'll see why I chose this one as we go along. This passage is quoted again in Matthew 12. You know, Matthew's gospel was written primarily to Jews. And so in Matthew's gospel, he spends a lot of time talking about the fulfillment of prophecy. And so in chapter 12 of Matthew, he quotes this passage out of Isaiah 42, and he says this is to fulfill the prophecy that was spoken by the prophet Isaiah as he talks about how Jesus ministers in Galilee and Jerusalem. And so it's quoted over there, and so this is an important passage, I think. But I want to talk about these bruised reeds and smoldering wicks. You know, it's pretty obvious that Isaiah was not really into, botany or horticulture. And he didn't really care about lamps so much. He's really talking about people, right? These bruised reeds and these smoldering wicks are actually people. But I think for a minute, let's think about a real reed that's bruised. Now, I think reeds are grasses. Is that right, Rusty?
They're what?
Well, a reed would be a grass.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so it'd be a grass. When we lived on our house over on Axtell, we had a patch of bamboo, which is also a grass, by the way. And that stuff, it's a noxious weed, frankly. If you ever get bamboo started in your yard, I'll pray for you, because it'll take over everything. Yeah, kind of like Bermuda, except a lot bigger. And it's a very strong grass. I mean, we use bamboo for a lot of things. Over in the Orient, in the Far East, they use bamboo to build houses. We now use it for flooring and some other things. But it was interesting, if they got bruised, they got hurt, they became much weaker. And so when you think about a bruised reed, in your mind, what do you see? You know, I see a reed that's maybe bent wrong, that's kind of maybe just a little weak. And then smoldering wicks. When you think about a smoldering wick, the other translations I told you were dimly lit wicks. And you think about a wick about to go out, that's what you get, a dimly lit wick. But have you ever dealt with a wick that was poorly trimmed? You know what I'm talking about? And they would smoke and make such a stink. Have you ever experienced that? They're kind of irritating, are they not? You see, as we think about people, I want us to think about bruised reeds and smoldering wicks maybe a little differently than we have in the past. Bruised reeds, people who are weaker now than they used to be. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And smoldering wicks, maybe their light's about to go out, but maybe they're smoking and stinking and they're just irritating people. So we've kind of defined all that, so let's think about how Jesus dealt with bruised reeds and smoldering wicks. You know, Jesus is about things that are different than the world, right? The world deals with bruised reeds and smoldering wicks by doing what? We cut down the bruised reeds and we get the smoldering wick extinguished as fast as we can so it doesn't smoke and stink anymore. But Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus defends them. Jesus loves them. Jesus honors them in a way. You know, we see that in how he treated the bruised reed of the woman caught in adultery. We see that in how Jesus treated the smoldering wick of the Samaritan woman at the well. We see it in how Jesus treated the bruised reed of Judas and the smoldering wick of James and John. Don't you think they were a bit irritating to the rest of the disciples? So with Jesus, we have this example of how to treat bruised reeds and smoldering wicks. So, how about us? Have you thought about the bruised reeds and the smoldering wicks in your life? You know, Cindy and I are in the midst of dealing with elderly parents. And if there was ever a bruised reed, it's the elderly. I never will forget one Sunday as I was leaving, this was several years ago, I met Elmer Robertson out in the parking lot. Y'all remember Elmer? Elmer was a cowboy and back in his day, probably a very strong guy. And he was failing in health and was having difficulty getting to his car in the parking lot. And he said to me, he said, "I didn't used to always be this way. I used to be strong." You see, he was a bruised reed. That instant reminded me of one of my favorite hymns. It's the hymn we sing on All Saints' Day sometimes called "For All the Saints." The music's beautiful. I'm not going to sing it for you. I want to read you one of the verses. And I don't want you to get hung up in the militaristic piece that might be in here, but there's a phrase in here I want you to hear. "And when the fight is fierce, the warfare long, steals on the ear the distant triumph song. And hearts are brave again, and arms are strong. Hallelujah, hallelujah." Cindy's grandmother used to say, "Getting old is not for sissies." They're not the only bruised reeds we deal with, though, right? There's a lot of other people that are damaged some way or another. And we just need to figure out how to deal with those folks with grace and love. Because that's what Jesus would do. But now let me move on to something else. Who do you have in your life that's a smoldering wick? I've quit preaching and gone to meddling. Do you have smoldering wicks in your life? People that irritate you? Now, some people just like to irritate because they can irritate. My dad had a cousin who was a preacher, and at one of the churches he went to, one of the congregants came up to him and said, "Preacher, I've been called to be a thorn in your flesh." A real candidate for a smoldering wick there, I think. So we have these folks, and the thing about smoldering wicks, a lot of time, not always, I really think this person who said that they've been called to be a thorn in the flesh probably was not lacking in self-esteem. But some smoldering wicks are. sometimes those people are very, very fragile. I've often said that if I treated so-and-so the way they treat me, they would be totally offended. And I hope that's my recognition that they are a smoldering wick that needs some encouragement. And it's hard sometimes to get there, right? To deal with these smoldering wicks in a way that helps them become flames again instead of a smoldering wick. So I want to talk about Trinity for a minute and ask us how we are doing collectively as a congregation dealing with bruised reeds and smoldering wicks. In some ways, I think we do very well. We've helped people all over the world. In Kenya, with a health hut for people who are bruised reeds. We have a library named after us in Kenya because of, well, mostly because of Edwin, but we did send some money, right? And in Haiti, we're doing a great work, I think. Well, we're financing a great work with the water catchment system. We've done water wells in Kenya. Those are bruised reeds, and we're helping them out. I think that we're doing a good job here, have done a good job here with the glue factory at New Beginnings, accepting the guys that have come our way in that. They were definitely bruised reeds or maybe some smoldering wicks, not sure always. But I'm proud of us in the Lord for how we've dealt with that we have dealt with them with grace and love. And that commends us. Dealing with people is a hard job, right? I mean, some people are just hard to deal with. Cindy's granddad used to say, oh, they just can't help it, they're a Yankee. I'm thinking smoldering wicks for that one, but you fill in whatever blank you want. And yet, God loves them too. So we have to treat them with grace. And now I'm going to get a little personal. What about you? Are you a bruised reed? Or a smoldering wick? As I was thinking about this, I couldn't help but think about people who decide that they can't go on in life and take their own life. Those really are bruised reeds and smoldering wicks. And sometimes we're shocked by that, and sometimes we're not. Hopefully nobody in here is at that point. If you are, there's help. Come visit with me. We'll get you with somebody. But I hope I'm not a smoldering wick. I suspect I am to somebody. Right? There's probably somebody out here. Maybe all of them. I don't know. But here's one of the things that I've noticed. As a parent, what I find about my children that irritates me the most is when they do the things that I do that irritate me about me. You notice that? And they kind of pay the price for that because I'm not very nice usually. And why? It's not their fault. It's my fault. They inherited it from me. I shouldn't be holding them accountable for that, right? But I think part of it is when you have kids, you start thinking they're going to be perfect. What you really want is the mixture of you and your spouse in the best way possible. And what you get is, it's like they went through the cafeteria line and they picked from one side or the other, right? And then they kind of added salt to it so it'd be a little bit more flavorful. And so it's just worse. Right? In my family, we had the blood pressure and cholesterol lottery. My mother had really high blood pressure and terrible cholesterol. Dad had relatively good blood pressure and low cholesterol. So, it was the lottery, which one did you get? So you would think between the two, you'd end up with kids that had relatively good blood pressure, maybe, and cholesterol that was decent. But what we got was, both my sister and I have blood pressure issues from my mother. And I got fairly good cholesterol, but my sister didn't. She got bad cholesterol. And it's, what bugs us about ourselves from our personalities or how we do things, we see those coming through in our kids. And like I say, that's what bugs us the worst about them. So, kind of where does this leave us? The world is full of bruised reeds and smoldering wicks, isn't it? As a matter of fact, at some level, we're all a bruised reed or a smoldering wick. Very few of us have not been damaged in some way by life. So as Christians, how are we supposed to deal with that? The example of Christ is great. This passage where Isaiah says, a bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out, just encapsulates so much of what I see in Jesus in his life on earth, where he treats people that we would not give the time of day to, probably. He treats them with respect and love. He always treats them as a person, not as a problem.